Richard walked through the double oak doors of courtroom 302, holding his mistress's hand, a customized Rolex catching the fluorescent light. He was absolutely certain he was about to leave his wife of 15 years with nothing but a modest settlement. He was wrong. By sunset, he wouldn't even own his own name. The air inside the Cook County family court was thick with the scent of old wood, floor wax, and impending ruin. Judge Thomas Caldwell, a man whose permanent scowl had ended more careers than a stock market crash, sat at the bench, flipping through a mountain of manila folders. At exactly 9 a.m., Richard Sterling made his entrance. Richard didn't just walk into a room, he purchased it with his presence. Dressed in a bespoke charcoal Tom Ford suit, he looked less like a man facing the dissolution of his 15-year marriage, and more like a CEO about to announce a hostile takeover. But the true spectacle wasn't his tailoring. It was the woman clinging to his left arm, Chloe Baxter, 26 years old, former VIP hostess at a high-end Chicago nightclub, and currently dripping in Van Cleef & Arpels jewelry that Richard had bought her just 3 weeks prior. She wore a tailored white designer dress, a deliberate mocking nod to the concept of matrimony, and a smirk that suggested she had already measured the drapes in the Sterling mansion. Richard escorted Chloe to the gallery bench right behind the defendant's table, leaning down to kiss her cheek in full view of the court. He whispered something that made her giggle, a sharp, piercing sound that echoed off the mahogany walls. Across the aisle, sitting completely motionless at the plaintiff's table, was Beatrice Sterling. Beatrice wore a simple, unbranded navy blue dress. Her hair was pulled back into an elegant, severe chignon. There was no visible jewelry on her, save for a plain gold band that she still wore on her right hand. For the past 6 months, the high society columns of Chicago had painted Beatrice as the tragic, discarded wife, a woman who had aged out of her husband's fast-paced, billion-dollar real estate empire. Richard had fed those rumors, subtly leaking stories of her mental instability and financial ignorance to justify his brazen affair. Sitting next to Richard was his attorney, Arthur Pendleton, a $1,500 an hour bulldog who specialized in making wealthy men's wives disappear with pennies on the dollar. "Everything is set," Arthur murmured to Richard, opening his leather briefcase. "We lead with the 2011 prenuptial agreement. It's ironclad, Richard. She gets the minimum standard payout, $500,000 and the old Volvo. The rest of the empire, the commercial properties, the liquid assets, they are walled off." Richard leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his legs. "Make it quick, Arthur. Chloe has a reservation for us at a Linnea at 8, and I don't want to be late." Judge Caldwell banged his gavel, the sound slicing through the low murmurs of the courtroom. "Court is in session. Sterling versus Sterling. Let's get on with it. Mr. Pendleton, I see you've filed a motion for summary judgment regarding the division of assets based on a pre-existing contract." Arthur stood, buttoning his suit jacket. "Yes, Your Honor. The matter before this court is remarkably simple. My client and Mrs. Sterling entered into a legally binding prenuptial agreement 15 years ago. Both parties had independent counsel. Mrs. Sterling signed it of her own free will. Under Section 4, Paragraph B of this agreement, in the event of a dissolution of marriage, Mrs. Sterling is entitled to a one-time lump sum of $500,000 and no claim to the Sterling Real Estate Group or its subsidiaries. We ask that the court honor the contract and finalize the asset division today." It was a brutal, clinical dismissal of a decade and a half of partnership. When Richard and Beatrice first met, Richard was drowning in debt, trying to flip rundown duplexes in the suburbs. It was Beatrice who had fronted the initial $50,000 from her modest inheritance to save his first major project. It was Beatrice who had managed the books for the first 6 years, while Richard shook hands and took the credit. But the prenup, pushed onto Beatrice just 3 days before their wedding, when she was emotionally vulnerable, erased all of that. Judge Caldwell adjusted his glasses and looked over at the plaintiff's table. Counselor, does the plaintiff wish to contest the validity of the prenuptial agreement? Beside Beatrice sat her attorney, Abigail Hayes. Abigail was not a celebrity lawyer. She operated out of a modest office in the Loop and wore off-the-rack suits. Richard had actually laughed when he saw Beatrice's legal representation on the docket, assuming his wife was too broke to afford anyone competent. Abigail stood up slowly, picking up a single piece of paper. "No, Your Honor," Abigail said, her voice clear and unnervingly calm. "We do not contest the prenuptial agreement. In fact, we wholeheartedly agree that it is ironclad." A ripple of confusion went through the courtroom. Richard blinked, exchanging a bewildered look with Arthur. In the gallery, Chloe let out a soft, triumphant sigh, crossing her legs and checking her phone. Even Judge Caldwell looked surprised. "You agree?" Judge Caldwell asked, raising an eyebrow. "Counselor, if you agree that the prenup is valid, then your client leaves here with virtually nothing. Are you sure you understand the stipulations of the document?" "Perfectly, Your Honor," Abigail said, stepping out from behind the table. She walked toward the center of the floor, her heels clicking rhythmically. "The prenuptial agreement dictates that Beatrice Sterling has no claim to the Sterling Real Estate Group, its legitimate subsidiaries, or any personal wealth accrued by Mr. Sterling through those legal declared channels. We fully accept those terms." Arthur Pendleton stood up, looking highly suspicious. "Then what are we doing here, Your Honor? If opposing counsel concedes, I move to close the proceedings. We concede to the division of declared marital assets, Your Honor," Abigail continued, turning to look directly at Richard. Her eyes were sharp, predatory. "However, the prenuptial agreement only protects assets that legally belong to Mr. Sterling. It does not protect assets acquired through corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and grand larceny. Nor does it protect the funds he stole from my client's grandfather's blind trust." The courtroom went dead silent. Richard's smug smile vanished, replaced by a sudden, rigid tension in his jaw. Behind him, Chloe lowered her phone, suddenly paying attention. "Objection!" Arthur roared, his face flushing red. "These are baseless, defamatory accusations. This is a simple divorce proceeding, not a federal witch hunt. Opposing counsel is throwing wild slander to extort a larger settlement." "I have the documentation right here, Your Honor," Abigail said, holding up a thick, bound ledger. "I'd like to call Richard Sterling to the stand." Judge Caldwell stared at Abigail, then at the furious Arthur Pendleton. The judge leaned forward, clearly intrigued. "Overruled, Mr. Pendleton. Your client will take the stand. Let's see exactly what kind of assets we are dividing today." Richard walked to the witness stand with tight, measured steps. The effortless arrogance he had displayed 20 minutes prior had evaporated, replaced by a cold, defensive posture. He placed his hand on the Bible, swore to tell the whole truth, and sat down, glaring at Abigail Hayes. He was still confident. He had to be. He had spent the last 5 years routing his private slush fund through a labyrinth of shell companies registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. He had hired the best forensic accountants to ensure his tracks were covered. There was no way Beatrice, who spent her days gardening and managing their social calendar, could have penetrated his financial fortress. "Mr. Sterling," Abigail began, pacing slowly in front of the jury box. "Let's establish some baseline facts. You are the sole CEO of Sterling Real Estate Group, correct?" "I am," Richard replied, his voice a low, authoritative baritone. "And according to the financial disclosures your team submitted to this court last week, your total liquid net worth, excluding your heavily mortgaged commercial properties, is roughly $12 million. That is correct. It's been a tough market." Richard lied effortlessly. He knew his actual liquid net worth was closer to $40 million. "A tough market indeed," Abigail nodded sympathetically. "Tell me, Mr. Sterling, if the market has been so tough, how did you manage to purchase a $4.5 million penthouse on the Upper East Side of Manhattan entirely in cash on October 14th of last year?" In the gallery, Beatrice didn't flinch, but Chloe shifted uncomfortably. That was her penthouse. The one Richard had told her was a company asset he was letting her use. "Objection," Arthur snapped from his table. "Relevance to the division of marital assets?" "It goes to the heart of the marital assets, Your Honor," Abigail countered. "The defense claims they have fully disclosed their finances. I am simply trying to understand how a man with $12 million in liquidity casually drops $4.5 million in cash without it appearing on his court-mandated financial disclosure forms." "I'll allow it," Judge Caldwell said. "Answer the question, Mr. Sterling." Richard adjusted his tie. "That property was not purchased by me personally. It was an acquisition made by an independent investment firm called Apex Ventures, LLC. I merely facilitated the transaction." "Ah, Apex Ventures, LLC," Abigail smiled, a terrifyingly bright expression. She walked over to her table and picked up a stack of bank statements, handing a copy to the bailiff to pass to the judge and another to Arthur. "Let the record reflect I am submitting Exhibit A, the incorporation documents for Apex Ventures, LLC, registered in Delaware." She turned back to Richard. "Mr. Sterling, who is the primary shareholder of Apex Ventures?" "It's a blind holding company," Richard said, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the armrests of the witness stand. "I don't know the specific shareholder structure." "You don't?" Abigail feigned surprise. "Because according to these documents, the sole registered agent and primary shareholder is a Ms. Chloe Baxter." A collective gasp echoed through the gallery. Several reporters in the back row began scribbling furiously. Chloe's face turned violently pale. She looked at Richard, wide-eyed, mouthing the words, "What is she talking about?" "Let me get this straight," Abigail continued, her voice rising in volume. "You took $4.5 million of unreported cash, funneled it into a dummy corporation in your mistress's name, and used it to buy her a luxury penthouse. Mr. Sterling, where did that initial $4.5 million come from?" "It was a business loan." Richard gritted his teeth. "Arthur, do something," he hissed under his breath. "Objection! Badgering!" Arthur yelled. "Overruled," Caldwell barked. "Sit down, Mr. Pendleton. The witness will answer the question." "If it was a business loan, Mr. Sterling," Abigail said smoothly, "why was the money wired from a private offshore account located in the Bahamas under the name Horizon Trusts?" Richard froze. The air left his lungs. Horizon Trusts. Only 3 people in the world knew about that account. Richard, his shady offshore banker, and... He looked across the room at Beatrice. For the first time since the proceedings began, Beatrice looked back at him. She didn't look angry. She didn't look betrayed. She looked entirely, mercilessly bored. "You see, Your Honor," Abigail turned to the judge, her tone shifting from aggressive to clinical. Mr. Sterling assumed his wife was completely ignorant of his affairs, both romantic and financial. What he forgot was that Beatrice Sterling personally set up the legacy digital infrastructure for his company 15 years ago. She never lost her administrative access to the primary servers. She has been watching him move money for 3 years. "That's illegal," Richard shouted, losing his composure. "She hacked my company." "She is a co-founder of the company, Richard," Abigail shot back. "Logging into her own administrative account is not hacking. But do you know what is illegal? Forgery." Abigail approached the witness stand, slamming a heavy folder down on the wood right in front of Richard. "Let's talk about Horizon Trusts. Horizon Trusts was originally set up in 1998 by Beatrice's late grandfather, leaving her a substantial tract of undeveloped commercial land in Texas. It was a separate, non-marital asset, untouchable under your ironclad prenuptial agreement." Abigail pulled a piece of paper from the folder. It was a loan origination document. On March 3rd, 2022, a loan for $9 million was taken out from a private equity firm. The collateral used for that loan was the Texas land held in Horizon Trusts. But Beatrice Sterling never authorized that loan. She never signed the collateral agreement. Abigail pointed a manicured finger directly at Richard's chest. "You did." The silence in courtroom 302 was absolute, heavy enough to crush bone. "You forged your wife's signature, Mr. Sterling. You illegally leveraged her inheritance to secure a $9 million cash loan. You then laundered that money through offshore accounts, brought it back on shore via Apex Ventures, and used it to buy real estate for your mistress and fund your lavish lifestyle, all while hiding it from the IRS and this court." "That's a lie," Richard whispered, but his voice shook. Sweat was beading on his forehead. He looked at Arthur Pendleton, but Arthur was staring at the forged document in his hands, his face ashen. Arthur was a divorce lawyer, not a criminal defense attorney, and he knew a sinking ship when he saw one. "We have sworn affidavits from the notary public who was bribed to stamp the document," Abigail pressed on, mercilessly. "We have the IP addresses proving the wire transfers were initiated from your private laptop. And, beautifully enough, we have a digital trail of receipts showing that the $500,000 you promised Beatrice in the prenup is actively sitting in the very same fraudulent offshore account." Abigail turned her back on him and walked toward the jury box, though her eyes remained locked on Judge Caldwell. "Mr. Sterling walked in here today, demanding the court enforce a prenuptial agreement. We gladly accept. The prenup states Beatrice gets no part of his legitimate business. Fine. But because Mr. Sterling commingled his stolen, fraudulent funds with his legitimate business accounts to keep the company afloat during the 2023 downturn, the Sterling Real Estate Group is no longer just a company. It is the active vehicle of a federal financial crime." Judge Caldwell took off his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. When he looked at Richard, there was no judicial neutrality left in his eyes, only disgust. "Mr. Pendleton," the judge said slowly, "I highly suggest you advise your client on his Fifth Amendment rights. Because as of right now, I am suspending these divorce proceedings and referring this entire matter to the United States Attorney's Office for immediate criminal investigation." In the gallery, Chloe Baxter stood up abruptly, her designer bag slipping from her shoulder. She didn't look at Richard. She didn't wait for permission. She turned on her heels and practically sprinted for the double oak doors, leaving her shattered meal ticket bleeding out on the witness stand. "Your Honor, I must formally request an immediate recess," Arthur Pendleton stammered, his usually booming voice reduced to a dry rasp. He was aggressively shoving his Mont Blanc pen and legal pads into his briefcase, refusing to make eye contact with the man sitting beside him. Furthermore, pending a review of these revelations, I will be filing a motion to withdraw as counsel for Mr. Sterling, citing an irreconcilable breakdown in attorney-client trust and potential exposure to ongoing criminal enterprise. Richard grabbed Arthur's forearm, his fingers digging into the expensive wool of the lawyer's sleeve. "You can't leave me," Richard hissed, a frantic, animalistic edge creeping into his voice. "I pay you a retainer of $200,000 a month. You fix this." "You paid me with stolen money, Richard." Arthur violently yanked his arm away. "My firm's compliance officers are going to have a stroke. I'm not going to federal prison for your offshore slush funds. You lied to me. We are done." Judge Caldwell watched the implosion from the bench, his expression entirely devoid of mercy. "Mr. Pendleton, your motion to withdraw is noted and will likely be granted by the end of the hour. However, sit back down. Neither of you is leaving this courtroom until I fully understand the scope of the fraud that has been presented in my jurisdiction." Arthur sank back into his chair, looking nauseous. Richard was trembling. The impenetrable armor of his Tom Ford suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for him. "Ms. Hayes," Judge Caldwell turned his attention back to Beatrice's attorney, "you mentioned that the Sterling Real Estate Group was the active vehicle for a federal financial crime. Commingling of funds is a serious allegation. The defense will argue the business itself should remain separate from his personal misdeeds. How do you plan to pierce the corporate veil today?" Abigail Hayes smiled. It was a cold, surgical smile. She walked back to her table, where Beatrice sat with perfect, terrifying posture. "We don't need to pierce the corporate veil, Your Honor," Abigail said smoothly. "We bought it." Richard's head snapped up. "What?" "Let me introduce Exhibit C into the record," Abigail said, handing a freshly printed, stapled document to the bailiff. "This is a notice of default and transfer of equity, executed at 8 a.m. this morning, signed and ratified by the Delaware Chancery Court." Abigail turned to face Richard, her voice echoing clearly in the stunned silence of the room. When Mr. Sterling forged his wife's signature to leverage her grandfather's blind trust, he took that $9 million loan from a private equity firm in Manhattan, Vanguard Capital Partners. He used his controlling shares in Sterling Real Estate Group as secondary collateral to secure the interest rate. Richard's face drained of the last remaining drop of color. How did you? Vanguard Capital Partners has very strict compliance regulations, Abigail continued, ignoring him. When my client, Mrs. Sterling, discovered the forgery 3 weeks ago, she did not go to the police immediately. Instead, we went directly to Vanguard Capital. We presented them with the irrefutable proof of the forged notary and the fraudulent wire transfers. We informed them that their $9 million loan was secured by a federal felony. Judge Caldwell leaned forward, resting his chin on his hands, utterly captivated. And how did Vanguard respond to knowing they were holding a toxic, criminal debt counselor? They panicked, Your Honor, Abigail replied matter-of-factly. Vanguard faced massive SEC fines, potential loss of their operating licenses, and a devastating public relations nightmare for failing basic due diligence and anti-money laundering checks. So, to avoid a massive lawsuit from the trust, Vanguard offered us a deal. Abigail tapped the document on the defense table. Vanguard quietly transferred the entire $9 million debt and the secondary collateral attached to it directly to Beatrice Sterling. They washed their hands of it. As of 8 a.m. this morning, Mrs. Sterling is the sole debt holder of Richard's fraudulent loan. And because Richard missed a shadow interest payment to the offshore account last Friday, because we froze the routing numbers, the loan is officially in default. "You can't do that!" Richard screamed, leaping from his chair. "That's my company. I built it. You can't just take my shares." "Sit down, Mr. Sterling, or I will have the bailiff strap you to the chair," Judge Caldwell roared, slamming his gavel. Richard collapsed back into his seat, breathing heavily, his eyes darting frantically around the room as if looking for an emergency exit. Under the strict covenants of the Vanguard loan agreement, which Mr. Sterling enthusiastically signed, a default immediately triggers the forfeiture of the secondary collateral, Abigail stated, her voice slicing through Richard's panic. Therefore, as of an hour ago, Beatrice Sterling exercised her right to call in the collateral. She legally seized Richard Sterling's 68% controlling interest in the Sterling Real Estate Group. Beatrice finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, cultured, and devastatingly calm. "I accept the $500,000 stipulated in the prenuptial agreement, Richard," she said, looking directly into his terrified eyes. "But in exchange, I now own your company. I own your desk. I own the commercial properties. And as the new majority shareholder, my first act of business was convening an emergency board meeting at 8:30 a.m. Beatrice picked up a single sheet of corporate letterhead. "The board has voted unanimously to terminate Richard Sterling as CEO, effective immediately, for gross misconduct, embezzlement, and breach of fiduciary duty. We have also forwarded our internal financial audits to the FBI." The courtroom was entirely paralyzed. The reporters in the gallery had stopped writing, too stunned by the sheer velocity of the corporate bloodbath they had just witnessed. Richard sat frozen. His mind was struggling to process the math. He had walked in with a net worth of $40 million, a thriving real estate empire, and a 26-year-old mistress waiting to be taken to a Michelin star restaurant. In less than 45 minutes, his wife had legally decapitated him. "Your Honor," Abigail addressed the bench. "Given that Mr. Sterling has been terminated from his company, and given that his personal liquid assets are currently sitting in fraudulent offshore accounts tied to his mistress's dummy corporation, we formally request an ex parte injunction. We ask the court to freeze all of Mr. Sterling's personal bank accounts, cancel his credit lines, and impound his passport, pending the imminent federal indictment." Arthur Pendleton didn't even attempt to object. He simply stared at the floor, calculating how quickly he could draft his resignation letter. Judge Caldwell picked up his pen. "Ms. Hayes, I have sat on this bench for 22 years. I have seen men hide money in mattresses, crypto wallets, and shell companies in Belize. But I have rarely seen a man construct his own guillotine with such spectacular arrogance." The judge signed the top sheet of the injunction heavily. "The plaintiff's motion is granted in full. The prenuptial agreement is upheld regarding the $500,000 payout. However, due to the uncontested evidence of severe financial fraud, forgery, and grand larceny, I am issuing an immediate, total asset freeze on Richard Sterling. All accounts held at Chase, First Fidelity, and Cayman National Bank under his name or social security number are locked as of this exact second." Judge Caldwell looked down at Richard. "Mr. Sterling, you no longer have access to company funds. You no longer have access to your personal checking accounts. Your credit cards will be declined. The federal authorities have been notified, and I suspect a subpoena duces tecum and a pair of handcuffs will be waiting for you before the week is out." "My car," Richard mumbled, his voice completely hollow. "I have my Aston Martin downstairs. I need to go." Abigail cleared her throat. "Actually, Your Honor, the 2024 Aston Martin DB12, currently parked in the courthouse garage, was leased under the Sterling Real Estate Group's executive transportation budget. As the new CEO, Mrs. Sterling has cancelled that lease. The repo company has already secured the vehicle." Richard stared at Abigail, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. "Furthermore," Abigail added, stepping closer to the defense table, the bespoke Tom Ford suit Mr. Sterling is wearing, and the customized Rolex Daytona on his wrist were purchased last month using a corporate credit card. Given that these were bought with embezzled corporate funds, they are technically the property of the Sterling Real Estate Group. "Oh, for God's sake," Arthur Pendleton muttered, finally showing a spark of life. "Are you going to strip the man naked in the courtroom?" "No," Beatrice said softly, standing up from her table. She walked around to the center of the aisle, stopping just a few feet from her soon-to-be ex-husband. "He can keep the suit. But I want the watch, Richard. It belongs to my company." Richard looked up at her. For the first time in 15 years, he truly saw the woman he had married. She wasn't the quiet, docile housewife he had mocked to his friends. She was the architect of his rise, and now the absolute orchestrator of his ruin. Slowly, with trembling hands, Richard unclasped the gold Rolex from his wrist. He placed it silently on the mahogany table. "Bailiff," Judge Caldwell called out, "please escort Mr. Sterling from the courtroom, and ensure he leaves the keys to the corporate penthouse and his company ID badge at the security desk." Two armed bailiffs approached the defense table. "Time to go, sir," the taller one said, his tone devoid of any respect. Richard stood up. His legs felt like lead. He looked back at the gallery, instinctively searching for Chloe, but the bench was entirely empty. Her designer perfume still lingered in the air, a ghost of the life he had just annihilated. He walked down the center aisle, flanked by the bailiffs. He had no car to drive home. He had no home to return to, as the mansion was technically owned by a trust he no longer controlled. His phone, paid for by the company, buzzed in his pocket, likely a notification from his bank that his accounts had just been restricted. He stepped through the heavy oak doors and out into the cold marble hallway of the Cook County Courthouse, a man who had entered as a king and left without even the loose change in his pockets. Back inside the courtroom, Beatrice picked up the heavy gold Rolex. She didn't put it on. She simply dropped it into her purse, closed the clasp with a sharp, satisfying snap, and turned to her lawyer. "Thank you, Abigail," Beatrice said, a faint, genuine smile finally breaking across her face. "I have a board meeting to get to. If you loved this courtroom drama and want to hear more insane true stories of cheaters getting exactly what they deserve, make sure to hit that like button. Don't forget to share this video with a friend who loves a satisfying plot twist, and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable real-life revenge stories every single week.